Hello, it's Monday. Welcome to from our studios in Southern California. Welcome to another episode of RUNTALK. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. I literally just got back from running. I just popped in the shower. That's why my hair is wet. This is so cool. I just get done running, just get done with the shower, and now here we are. On today's episode, we're going to talk about something I just got the idea. Sometimes social media can be a good thing. Usually it's not a good thing. But every once in a while it gives you an idea. And so I got the idea for today's episode from something I saw this morning on social media talking about anaerobic training and aerobic training and the balance of the two. And the thing I saw that was posted, it was in one of the running groups on Facebook. I hope they're watching now, I don't know. But what the person posted, and they were quoting somebody else, and they said that aerobic training affects your ability to do anaerobic work. The aerobic training affects anaerobic training ability, is exactly what they said. And people don't think about the things that they write. And so today's episode, I wanted to talk about whether or not that's true and how much aerobic training you need to do as a runner versus how much anaerobic training that you need to do. So today's episode is all about aerobic training and anaerobic training, and how much of each do you really need to do to become a better runner and to realize your potential as a runner. And we'll talk about the differences between sprinters and distance runners, because I think that helps the conversation. And I think when people talk about distance running, like this person who had posted, he was referring to distance running. And when people talk about distance running, they seem to forget sprinters and what sprinters do. And so let's first start talking about this issue of the aerobic training and how it affects, or if it affects at all, the anaerobic training. And so what this person had posted was that aerobic training affects anaerobic training ability. And so the question that I posed then, I posed the question, well, if that were true, then why don't sprinters do aerobic work? You look at 100-meter sprinters, 200-meter sprinters, all they do is anaerobic work. They do a warm-up and a cool-down, and that stuff may be aerobic. But all the training they do, whether it's sprint work on the track, or technique work, or strength training in the gym, the plyometric training that they do, all the training that sprinters do, with the exception of warm-ups and cool-downs, is all anaerobic. And it's the same thing in other sports as well. You don't see basketball players and football players going out on aerobic jogs. And so if the aerobic training really affected anaerobic training ability, then you would think that sprinters who do a lot of anaerobic work would also do aerobic work, if it's true that the aerobic training affects your ability to do anaerobic work. Because wouldn't sprinters want to do better anaerobic work? And so that's where that argument kind of falls apart, that there is no evidence that aerobic training affects anaerobic training ability. It's two aspects of metabolism, and they occur in different parts of the muscle. Metabolism, if you ever study metabolism, is very compartmentalized. I usually make the joke that metabolism must have been invented by a guy, because guys are always compartmentalized in how they think. Women, they mix a lot of things together, and they can multitask, and they think about things and how they relate to each other, whereas guys tend to think in compartments. It's either this way or that way. So I always do make the joke about metabolism must have been invented by a guy, because metabolism is very compartmentalized. Aerobic metabolism happens inside the mitochondria, whereas anaerobic metabolism, glycolysis, the breaking down of glucose, happens in the cytosol, which is the fluid-filled portion of muscle. It happens outside of the mitochondria. And so anaerobic metabolism doesn't even occur in the same place of muscle as aerobic metabolism does. And so there is no evidence that aerobic training affects your ability to do anaerobic training. There's no evidence of that. There is no science behind a statement like that. Hi, Christopher. Christopher comes every week. You're like my biggest fan, Christopher. Thank you very much for coming. So let's get into how much aerobic work a distance runner needs to do versus how much anaerobic work. And a lot of this comes down to adaptation. For some reason, which I don't know that anybody has discovered yet, it takes longer to adapt to aerobic training than it does to anaerobic training. And we're not sure why. Maybe there is some evolutionary reason for the adaptations of aerobic training to happen more slowly than the adaptations with anaerobic training. Maybe, and I'm just speculating here, this is my hypothesis, that maybe our need to develop speed and power to run away from other animals quickly when we're being chased in the wild, maybe that needed to happen more quickly. Maybe our ability to sprint we had to adapt to that more quickly because maybe we had to develop that ability more quickly than the aerobic ability. I don't know. I don't know if anyone has ever looked at this from an evolutionary standpoint as to why the adaptations from anaerobic training happen more quickly. I mean, every coach knows, every runner knows that, not every runner, but a lot of them know that it takes less time to develop speed than it does to develop endurance. Now the question is why. I'm not sure why that is. Again, there may be an evolutionary reason for that we needed to develop anaerobic sprint power abilities more quickly than we needed to develop the aerobic system. So there could be a reason for that. Well, of course there's a reason. I just don't know what that reason is. Everything has a reason for it. We just lots of times don't know what the reason is. But that's why we have scientific inquiry. That's the beauty of science and developing hypotheses and testing those hypotheses, because we get to an understanding of why things are the way they are, why we are the way we are. It's fascinating. So that's one reason why distance runners need to do more aerobic work than anaerobic work, because it takes longer to develop yourself aerobically. The adaptations take longer than anaerobically. And the question is, how much longer? Well, that is pretty independent. Some people adapt rather quickly, like if you have a lot of slow twitch muscle fibers, then you will have a greater propensity for aerobic training. And so you'll want to spend more time on that because that's what you're naturally gifted for. Whereas some people have more percentage of fast twitch fibers, and so they wouldn't want to spend as much time training aerobically because they're not going to adapt to that as well as somebody who's got slow twitch fibers. And so it's pointless to keep doing more and more and more aerobic work when you've got a lot of fast twitch fibers. It's like, why would Usain Bolt go out and run mile after mile after mile? It's not going to help him be a better runner, even a better distance runner. If he chose to do distance, it wouldn't even help him because he's built for speed. And so you have to look at where your strengths and weaknesses lie, and that will also dictate to a certain extent how much time you spend on each aspect of metabolism, the aerobic versus the anaerobic. Gwen is saying, I saw the same post. Thank you for discussing. Okay, very good, Gwen. I'm glad to thank you for joining us. And so, getting back to that issue, is that there's no evidence that your aerobic training will affect your ability to do more anaerobic work. One of the proponents of that, and the reason for this post, it was in this group, it came from Arthur Lydiard. Arthur Lydiard, even though he was a great coach and had a lot of success with his athletes, he also speculated on a lot of things that there's no way he could have known. The other thing Arthur Lydiard used to say, talking about aerobic versus anaerobic, is he believed that if you do too much anaerobic training, that you drop the pH in muscle from too much anaerobic training, that negatively affects aerobic metabolism. Again, there is no scientific evidence to suggest that if you do a lot of anaerobic training, it impairs your aerobic fitness. I don't know where Arthur got that. There's no way he could have known that unless he actually measured aspects of metabolism after doing a significant amount of anaerobic work, which he never did. So there's no way he could have known that. But Lydiard used to say a lot of things. He did this a lot too with the recruitment of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fiber. There's no way he could have known a lot of the things that he said. But he speculated a lot and acted as if it were the truth. So anyway, the point is you've got to be critical of what you read, and you have to study, and you have to understand what it is you're reading, and always question, am I reading something, is this true? And so let's get back to the aerobic and anaerobic. So how much aerobic training does one need? Well, given that it takes longer in general, depending on, again, your specifics of your muscle fiber type, even though we know it takes longer to develop aerobically than it does to develop yourself anaerobically, that would suggest then that you need more aerobic work, that you need more aerobic work than anaerobic work. And that, to a certain extent, is true. That The aerobic side is really what dictates performance in a distance runner. And the reason for that really is more about one aspect of carbohydrate metabolism. It's the final step in carbohydrate metabolism, glycolysis, when we produce pyruvate. Nobody talks about pyruvate. Everyone talks about lactate or lactic acid. Nobody talks about pyruvate. Pyruvate is the key to how fast of a runner you're going to be. Because when we break down glucose, the faster we run, just to give a background, we go outside, you do a slow walk or a slow jog, you're using more fat than carbohydrate. But even a moderate pace run, you still start to use more carbohydrate than fat. If you were to take a slow, easy walk, you might be using more fat than carbohydrate. And then as you get a little bit faster, a little bit faster, a little bit faster, you start to rely more on carbohydrate and less on fat. And so when you're running even at a modest intensity, about 75% VO2 max, that's a modest intensity, feels comfortable, you're already using more carbohydrate than you are fat. And the faster you run, the more carbohydrate you're going to use. And so the greater the involvement of glycolysis, which is literally the breaking down of glucose. So that just gives you a background. The final step of glucose metabolism, the final step of glycolysis, is that we produce pyruvate. And when we get to pyruvate, there is a fork in the road of metabolism. There's an aerobic fork and there's an anaerobic fork. And which fork we take is going to dictate the speed at which we fatigue. And so the goal is to go the aerobic fork. Pyruvate has two fates. It can either be oxidized inside the mitochondria through the Krebs cycle, and that's why I'm making a circle, because it's a cycle. So it can either be oxidized inside the mitochondria through the Krebs cycle. We have to turn pyruvate into something, another biomolecular intermediate, acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA is what gets us inside the Krebs cycle, but that's semantics. We take the pyruvate, and via acetyl-CoA, we enter the Krebs cycle. And then we go around and around and around the Krebs cycle. Sometimes it's called the TCA cycle. You all learned this in high school biology class. So remember high school biology class. For some of you, that may have been yesterday. For some of us, that was a long time ago. But we all remember the Krebs cycle, named after Hans Krebs. And so I'm making a circle with my arm, so you follow the Krebs cycle. We can oxidize pyruvate through the Krebs cycle, or we can take the anaerobic fork and chemically reduce that pyruvate into lactate. Which is going to dictate, what is going to dictate which fork we take, the aerobic fork or the anaerobic fork? What's going to dictate that is the amount of mitochondria and mitochondrial enzymes that you have. How much Krebs cycle activity do you have? Because the more Krebs cycle activity you have, which is inside the mitochondria, so the more mitochondria we have, the more Krebs cycle activity we have, and the more enzymes associated with the Krebs cycle that we have. The more of that we have, which we develop through aerobic work, through aerobic training, then the faster speed we can run, because the faster we can get pyruvate, the more pyruvate we can get inside the mitochondria, inside the Krebs cycle. And so you can think of, the term lactate threshold gets thrown around a lot. Even though we measure lactate, and that's how we determine lactate threshold, the way you really think of what the lactate threshold represents, now listen closely, because this is what you came for, the way you really think about what the lactate threshold represents is the fastest speed that you can run at which Krebs cycle activity can still keep up with the production of pyruvate from glycolysis. Once Krebs cycle activity, I'm making a circle again, this is the Krebs cycle. Once Krebs cycle activity can no longer keep up with the production of pyruvate that is coming from glycolysis, the breaking down of glucose, then we will be forced to rely more on anaerobic metabolism, and that pyruvate will be chemically reduced into lactate because it can no longer get funneled into the mitochondria to be oxidized in the Krebs cycle. So that's really the way to think of the lactate threshold. The operational definition, the reason it's called lactate threshold, is because it's the speed above which, the maximum speed above which lactate starts to accumulate. And lactate accumulates because now we are relying more on anaerobic production of breaking down of carbohydrates. So it's more of the conversion, the anaerobic conversion of pyruvate into lactate. And so we start to accumulate lactate. But the reason why that happens is because Krebs cycle activity can no longer keep up with the production of pyruvate from glycolysis. So how do we make it keep up so that we can run at a faster speed and still funnel that pyruvate inside the mitochondria into the Krebs cycle? Through aerobic training. And that's why aerobic training is king to distance running performance, because you want to make as much mitochondria as possible, as much Krebs cycle activity and enzymes associated. There are multiple enzymes associated with the Krebs cycle: citrate synthase, succinate dehydrogenase. You learned all these enzymes in high school biology class. There's about, I don't even remember, 7, 8, 9, 10 enzymes associated with the Krebs cycle, and then there's more enzymes associated with the next part of aerobic metabolism, the electron transport chain. And so there's a whole host of enzymes that catalyze all these chemical reactions. There's a bunch of steps that we go through in the Krebs cycle. Each step is catalyzed by a different chemical reaction, by a different enzyme. And so that's why you need to do more aerobic training than anaerobic training as a distance runner. Sprinters, quite different. Sprinters couldn't care less about Krebs cycle activity. It's not involved. It's a negligible amount involved in running 100 meters, 200 meters, even 400 meters. There's a slight involvement in the 400 meters, but then when you get into the distance running events, 800 meters and up, huge involvement. It's the most important involvement. And so that's why you need to do more aerobic work than anaerobic work, because you want to beef up how much Krebs cycle activity you have so that you can funnel that pyruvate into the Krebs cycle at faster and faster speeds. Because remember, the faster you run, the more reliance on carbohydrate metabolism. And so the more pyruvate that you're making. And so I always use the example of I Love Lucy episode, the chocolate episode of I Love Lucy, where you have the chocolates coming down the conveyor belt. And so you can either keep trying to speed up the conveyor belt or make more conveyor belts. The conveyor belts are the factory, the factories that the conveyor belt's sitting. That's the mitochondria, that's the Krebs cycle. And so the more conveyor belts you have, the more chocolates can be wrapped in a given amount of time. And that's why aerobic metabolism is so important. That's why aerobic training is so important. Does that make sense? Yes or yes? And so that's why you need to do more aerobic training. Now the question is how much? Going back to Arthur Lydiard, he had Peter Snell and his other 800 meter runners run up to 100 miles per week. And I talked to Peter Snell before he passed away a year ago. I got a chance to meet him and talk to him several years ago, and it was true. He parts of the year he did run up to 100 miles a week. Every Sunday he would run a 22-mile hilly course outside of Auckland, in the hills of the countryside outside of Auckland, New Zealand. And he did that every Sunday for years. And so he ran a lot, and Arthur Lydiard really believed in running a lot of miles per week, at least at certain times of the year, even for middle distance runners. Now the question is, how much? Is that necessary? Did Peter Snell really need to run 100 per week to run a race that took him 1 minute and 44 seconds? Well, probably not. I mean, he got far on his talent. He probably could have run 60 miles a week or 70 a week, and he probably still would have run just as fast as he did. 100 miles a week may be excessive. And, we never hear about all the athletes Arthur coached who were not successful. We only hear about the ones who were. And that's true of most coaches. You look at most college coaches, for every star athlete, there are 10 who never made it anywhere. But you only hear about the stars. And so you have to be critical when you look at what athletes do, and that's another mistake that a lot of coaches and runners will make, is that they will look at, well, what are the best runners doing, and then they get their training advice from that. And that's a huge mistake, because what makes runners really successful, what makes an Olympic gold medalist, has little to do with their training and a lot more to do with their talent. And so unless you have the same talent that they have, then it's pointless to copy the training that they're doing. We can learn from what elite athletes do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how everybody should train. Because what makes them elite more than any other factor is their genetic talent, not their training. We see this all the time. And then we see this with coaches. The athletes make a name for the coach rather than the other way around. It's not the coaches who are making the athletes good. What makes the athletes good is their talent, and the training just brings that talent to the forefront. So always be careful when you read about what the best runners are doing, because you have to ask yourself, well, what is really causing them to run as fast as they do? Is it a direct relationship to their training, or is it something else? And one of the ways that we know that we can prove this is that you see elite athletes changing coaches all the time. Very few elite athletes have stuck with one coach their entire career. And so they move around from coach to coach. It doesn't make a difference. They don't run significantly faster once they change their coach. They're lucky if they improve by a few seconds in a 5K race or a couple of minutes in a marathon. We see this all the time. And so it's not the training or the coaching philosophy that's making the difference. It's more the talent. Once you reach a certain level, you plateau, and it's really hard to squeeze out more. You're talking about minuscule amounts of time that you're trying to squeeze out to become a better runner at that level. And so it's really the compounded effect of more years of training that's making the difference, not the specific kind of training that you do. You see this in young athletes a lot. When you're 19, 20, 21, 22 years old, you get better from year to year just because you have more training under you, not necessarily the specific kind of training that you're doing. But I digress. Let's get back to the point. Justin says, pretty crazy, the half marathon world record yesterday. I know, yeah, yesterday a guy runs 58:30 or 57:30 something, 57:32 or something like that. Yeah, definitely a talent. Yeah, of course. When you look at what these runners do, 4:23 per mile. Some guy from Kenya yesterday in Valencia, Spain, runs 4:23 per mile for 13.1 miles. I've been to Kenya. I saw firsthand how they train. They don't train scientifically at all. They train in groups. They train very, very hard, and they run a lot. Some of them, they run 3 times a day. There's nothing else to do there. They run a lot, but there's nothing to distract them like we have over here in the U.S. with reality TV shows. Everyone's watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians or Real Housewives of Orange County. They don't have that stuff to distract them over there in Kenya. It's a third world country. They don't have television over there, and so they run a lot. But they don't train scientifically at all, which was surprising when I went over there, and I spent a couple weeks there, and I'm looking forward to going back once the pandemic is over. I can't wait to go back. But they don't train scientifically at all over there, and so it's not really the training that's making them so good. It's just that they train a lot, even though it may be not scientific, and they have a huge amount of genetic potential over there. It's a large amount of talent in a very small part of Kenya. It's fascinating to study it. But it's not even all of Kenya that's good. It's just a very small part of Kenya in which they're very, very good. As a whole country, they're not so good. It's just interesting that, a couple of different tribes, the Nandi tribe, the Kalenjin tribe, they're very good distance runners. But I digress. Thank you, Justin, though, for making me digress. That was good. Anyway, it's always great to study elite athlete performance because you get an understanding of what the human body can do at its most extreme case. I love that. Very fascinating area of research to look at what human beings can do at the most extreme. It gives you an understanding of what the human body is capable of doing. So let's get back to the aerobic and anaerobic training. So how much aerobic training is enough? I wrote an article many years ago for Running Times magazine about this concept of how much aerobic training is enough. And so the question is, the answer is that enough training that you will physically continue to adapt to. So there is some trial and error to this. It seems that, if we take the best runners in the country or in the world, that somewhere is between 70 and 120 miles per week. So that's a pretty big span already, but somewhere between 70 and 120 per week seems to be the sweet spot of what the best runners do. Now that doesn't mean that that's what everybody needs to do. Everyone's going to have their sweet spot. But to answer the question of how much aerobic training is enough for you, it takes a little bit of trial and error because you have to run more. That's a generalization that can be made. Everybody should be running more than what they're currently running unless they're already at the upper limits of what they can physically handle. But you want to run as much as you continue to adapt to. So only keep training more if you have reason to believe that more will make you better. And the way you do that is by trying it. You try to increase your mileage a little bit at a time and then do some tests. You either do specific workouts to do a test or do a time trial or run a race. You do some kind of a fitness test to see over time, am I still getting better with the increase in volume, with the increase in mileage? And over time, you'll learn what your sweet spot is. Where do you perform the best? Don't just run more for the sake of running more, unless that more is going to help you run better. Unless you just really just love running so much that you just want to run more and more and more, even if it doesn't make you better, then that's fine. That's another purpose. But if your purpose is to use your running to become a better runner, and you want to find out how much you need to train to be a better runner, then that's one way to learn, is find out, if I add 5 more miles a week or 10 more miles a week, what kind of an effect is that going to have on my running performance? Will I get better? How much better? Once I get better, should I add another 5 to 10? At what point do I stop? When your performance plateaus and you see that you're no longer making improvement, and you start tweaking other areas of your training. Or maybe at that point, then it's time to drop down in volume and add the anaerobic work. And so that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is, how much can I physically do without getting injured? If 50 miles a week is going to make you injured, then why do 50? Stay at 40 if 40 is safe for you. We each have our breaking point. We each have a volume of training that is going to cause us an injury. And so you don't want to cross that line. You want to get right up to that line, but not cross the line. And so again, there's going to be some trial and error. No amount of research can tell you specifically at what level of mileage you're going to get injured. We know averages. We know that on average, the risk of running-related injury goes up a lot if you exceed 40 miles a week. But for some people, 40 miles a week may be nothing. That may, if they're used to 90 a week, then 40 a week is less than half of that. And so there's going to be variability in this. We all are going to have the level of running at which we're going to be causing an injury. And so you have to find that for yourself. Once you find that level, then stay at that level for a while. Stay at that level for as long as you feel like you need to take to adapt, and when you start to see your performance plateau. And when you start to see a performance plateau, then you know it's time to cut back on the volume, maybe make a slight decrease in the volume, and start to add more intensity. And that's when you get into the anaerobic work. And how long it takes you to adapt to the anaerobic work, that depends on how much anaerobic work you're doing. If you only do 1 workout a week, then you can do more weeks of anaerobic work. If you're doing 2 anaerobic workouts a week, then it'll be a shorter amount of time. So it's hard to say exactly how much anaerobic work you need to do, because a lot of that depends on how many times per week you're doing an anaerobic workout. If you're only doing 1 anaerobic workout a week, you may be able to do anaerobic work for 3 months or even 4 months, because you're only having that stimulus once a week. If you have that stimulus 2 or 3 times a week, then it'll be a much shorter amount of time. And again, you're going to have to experiment with that to find out how many weeks do I need of, say, 2 anaerobic workouts per week before I'm hitting a peak in my training and in my performance, notably my performance. And so it's hard to say exactly how long each phase of training needs to be, because there's got to be some experimentation with that. But spend more time on the aerobic work than the anaerobic work. Now, everything I just said, while that's true, now we need to wipe the slate clean and start over again. Because now you got to start thinking outside the box. Because there's more than one way to train. What I just described, and this is all in my next book that comes out next year. I recently submitted to the publisher. I'm looking forward to that book coming out. But all this describes is linear periodization. You start by increasing the volume, getting the volume up, and then over time you decrease the volume and you increase the intensity. That's the linear way to periodize. It never should have been called linear because it's really curvilinear. It's not a linear drop or linear increase. It's more of a curvilinear, but that's semantics. I talk about that in the book. There's another way to build endurance. If you look at swimmers, if any of you listening are swimmers, then you know that swimmers train mostly with interval workouts. They do a high volume of interval workouts. And there have been few select runners who have also done this over the course of training history, if you read about the history of training. Emil Zatopek from Czechoslovakia, he was a well-known runner in the 1940s and 50s. He won the Olympic 10K in the 48 Olympics in And then 1952, he won the 5K, the 10K, and the marathon. The only person to ever win all three distance races like that in the same Olympics. Now people don't even try to do that. But Emil Zatopek trained with a high volume of interval. He used to do like 40 times 400 meters. Now, obviously, if you're doing 40 times 400 meters, each 400 is not that fast. But it's higher quality than if you were just to go out and do an easy distance run. Jim Ryan, who most people know the name Jim Ryan, former world record on the mile, and first high school runner to break a 4-minute mile, ran 3:55. This was back in the 1960s. He ran a 3:55 mile. It took like 36 years or something before Alan Webb ran faster than that to break the high school record. And so Jim Ryan ran a 3:55 mile when he was in high school. His coach in high school was a swim coach. He came from the swim team. And so he trained his runners on his high school team the same way he would train his swimmers, high volume of interval training. And so that's another way to build endurance. You don't necessarily have to go out and run aerobically easy all the time to build up the volume. You can also build up your volume by doing an enormously high volume of intervals. The problem, however, with that is that you got to be careful, because unlike with swimming, there is a much greater risk of injury with running because it's weight bearing. Swimmers can do that. Swimmers don't often just go and swim unless they're like an ocean swimmer or something like that, or a triathlete swimming in open water. Competitive swimmers in the Olympics, they don't do a lot of just easy long distance swims the way runners go out and do easy long runs. But the problem with running is that it comes with a greater risk of injury. So if you're going to do a high volume of interval training as a runner, you just got to be really careful, because you don't want to hurt your Achilles tendon or your calves. It puts a lot more stress on the lower leg musculature and the Achilles tendon. And so you don't want to just go blast out very fast workouts. You can do a high volume of interval training and still have it be aerobic. Like you can do threshold or even sub-threshold where it's all aerobic, and you're just doing a high volume of it rather than go on continuous runs all the time. And so sometimes it's helpful to think outside the box of training and not just do things the way they have always been done. One of the things, I tend to criticize a lot of coaches and sometimes Lydiard, because he said a lot of things that there's no way he could have known. But one of the things that made Lydiard great is that he did think outside the box, and he loaded runners up on a high volume of running. And that was something that was not done prior to Lydiard. And that was one of the reasons why he probably had the success he had, because we now know that a high volume is beneficial to a distance runner. But at the time, that was a novel idea. And he experimented on himself, and he would go out and run like up to 250 miles a week. I don't know how he handled that, but maybe he was structurally sound and he handled that. But he would experiment on himself. And so you got to start thinking outside the box in order to be able to come up with other ideas of how to train instead of just always doing things traditionally. And this is something that I've given a lot of thought to over the years about coming at the endurance from a different perspective, especially if you're more of a middle distance runner like Jim Ryan was. It may not be as helpful for middle distance runners to just go and do a lot of slow, easy runs. There's other ways to build that stamina, to build that endurance. And one way is to do a higher volume of intervals and do it more often per week, similar to the way swimmers train. But just be careful, because there's a greater injury risk potential with running compared to swimming. And so that's just something I wanted to share with you, to start thinking outside the box and always question what you read and think about, well, can this be done a different way given my unique physiology? Look at yourself and think about, well, what's best for me? Do I think I have more speed? Do I think I have more endurance? You got to ask yourself these questions. When you get into a race, do you have a hard time maintaining the pace of other people, but then you can outkick them at the end? Or is it just the opposite? Do you get outkicked at the end, but you have a better time holding the pace in the middle of the race? That gives you indication about, are you better for speed? Are you better for endurance? And so these are questions that you need to ask yourself. And then you tailor the training to what you're genetically predisposed for. And so, I just wanted to give an overview of the anaerobic versus aerobic training. And so to get into the specifics, aerobic training would be threshold and below. Anything that is at your lactate threshold and below would be considered aerobic training. Your threshold is slower, think of it in terms of that. Slower than your threshold is aerobic training. Whereas once you get above your lactate threshold, now you've introduced a significant anaerobic contribution. It's still more aerobic than not aerobic. Like if here's your threshold and you're training here, it's still more aerobic than not aerobic, but you have now started to introduce a significant anaerobic contribution because of going back to what I said before, that the Krebs cycle activity can no longer sustain the amount of pyruvate coming down the glycolytic conveyor belt, and now you have to convert some of that pyruvate into lactate. And so there's now a significant anaerobic contribution. So anything above, anything faster than your threshold has a significant anaerobic contribution. So even when you do VO2 max intervals, there's still there's a great deal of anaerobic metabolism occurring when you do VO2 max work. It's not until you get even faster than VO2 max work that it becomes almost purely aerobic. So when you get into like 100 meter, 200 meter, and even 400 meter reps that are done very, very fast, like an 800 meter race pace, or even slightly slower, like 400 meter reps at mile race pace, if you're a pretty fast miler, then that will be predominantly anaerobic. And certainly when you're running at 800 meter race pace, that will be predominantly anaerobic. And so it's not until you get into that kind of training that then it becomes predominantly anaerobic. But even when you do VO2 max training, then there's still a significant anaerobic contribution, even though it's more aerobic than anaerobic. But how you balance the two, there's not an easy answer to that. It just comes down to what you're genetically predisposed for and how much of each you give. That's kind of the art of training, is to understand for each runner, how much of each stimulus do you give? That's where the art comes in, but it's also a science because you're addressing that based on that runner's biochemistry, based on that runner's physiology. When you know that you have a runner that is like 90% slow twitch, then you load up on the aerobic work and you just sprinkle in a little bit of anaerobic work when the time comes to do that. Whereas conversely, if you know you have a lot of fast twitch fibers and speed is your strength, then you want to cater to that and skew the training toward more anaerobic work and do just enough aerobic work that you meet the demands of the race that you're training for. Nowadays everybody wants to do the marathon because the marathon represents the holy grail. But if you've got a lot of fast twitch muscle fibers, you can run a marathon, but that's not going to be your best race. If you want to do what you know that you're genetically predisposed for, then it's better to skew your training and your racing to that rather than constantly try to work against the grain of your own physiology and your own biochemistry. There's no holy grail about the marathon. Ask yourself, what are you best at? What if your parents were athletes, what were they best at? And then skew your training, your racing to that. And that's why, people always give me a hard time. I've only run 2 marathons. Because I know that my strength is not that. I've always been better at the 800 meters at mile than I am at the longer races. All you have to do is look at the amount of muscle mass on my legs to know that that's true. I mean, it's hard for me to run a marathon. I've got a lot of muscle mass on my legs. And I'm not as good with the endurance kind of training. I'm not as good at the hard endurance training, the aerobic training. And I'm much better at the shorter, faster stuff on the track. And so I've always skewed my training and racing to that. And so I urge you to do the same. So that's an overview of aerobic versus anaerobic training. There are very different types of training. One does not affect the other. The only way in which too much anaerobic training, we'll say this, the only way that too much anaerobic training can affect aerobic is that you could be sacrificing the aerobic work. If you're always doing anaerobic work, then then you don't have as much time to do the aerobic work. And that's the problem we see at the high school level, where the kids are racing all the time. They may be doing 2 track meets during the week and another track meet on the weekend, and so the day before they're not doing a lot of volume. That's why I put a whole chapter in the book on how to train high school and college runners, because that's a big issue. You got to try to get around that issue. And so because young runners do a lot of speed work, they're neglecting the aerobic side, and so that becomes a problem because you have to build up the aerobic side. But that's the only reason why that affects that. It doesn't affect it because there's not something inherently bad about causing acidosis inside the muscle from anaerobic work. That acidosis is taken care of within 30 to 60 minutes of the workout. If you were to measure muscle pH right after the workout and pH is lowered, your body will bring that pH right back up within 30 to 60 minutes of the workout being done. And so there's no negative impact of the acidosis on aerobic metabolism or vice versa. I don't know where Lydiard got that from. There's no way he could have known that. But there's no evidence to suggest that that's the case. But we do know that if you build up the aerobic side, but there's other ways to do that. You can do that through a lot of easy running. You can do that through a high volume of interval training. And if the volume of the workout is high enough, like if you're doing 20 reps, 30 reps, then the intensity won't be that high. It won't be like you're sprinting every single rep, because then you wouldn't be able to do 20, 30, and then it defeats the purpose of the workout. If you're going to build endurance, then you have to do a high volume of the intervals. And the way you do the high volume is you have to reduce the intensity. And so you can do 400-meter reps or 800-meter reps at threshold pace and then just do a bunch of them. Do 20 or 30 of them. But you're only running no faster than threshold pace to do that, so the workout remains aerobic. And so that's a great way to build specific aerobic endurance rather than just go out and run easy all the time. And so that gives you an overview of the difference between aerobic and anaerobic training and how much of each you need to do. So I urge you to experiment. And so that gets us to the final thought of the day. Every episode of Run Talk, I finish with a final thought of the day. And today's episode is all about experimentation. Be your own scientist. Science is getting a lot of attention right now because of the pandemic. And a lot of people will poo-poo the science. For some reason, they don't believe in it. I don't understand. I never understood that. People ask, do you believe in the science? Science is not something to be believed in or not believed in. Science is true whether you believe in it or not. It's not a belief. It's not a belief system. Faith is a belief. You have faith in something. You believe in a higher power. You believe that things will work out the way they're meant to work. That's a belief. There is no belief or disbelief about science. Science is always correct, no matter what you believe. Gravity exists. If I hold up a piece of paper, I know it's going to drop because gravity. It's only not going to drop if I'm in outer space. If I go to outer space and I do that, it's not going to drop. But there's a gravitational pull of the Earth, and so if I drop a piece of paper, it falls down toward the Earth's core. That is a truth. You can't believe that or not believe that. Experiment. That's the final thought of the day. That come up with a hypothesis. This is how science works. Based on the research that has been done before, you read all the research that has been done before you, all the scientific studies that have been done. You read all that, you acquire a certain understanding of the way things are. Based on that body of research, we call that a literature review. In the scientific community, we do a literature review. Every time you write a paper, you do a lit review. You do a literature review of all the work that came before. And then based on that literature review and what you have learned, then you use this and you come up with some hypotheses. And you say, you know what? Based on all this line of research, I think if I tested this, I think this would happen. Not because that's just my thinking, not just because that's what I believe, it's because what I believe based on all of the work that came before me. Based on all of that other research, it leads me to the conclusion that this is what's going to happen. If I made this little perturbation, this little change, then this is what's going to happen. That's how they developed the vaccine, by the way. They know how vaccines work because of all the experimentation that's been done many years prior. That we know if we apply this stimulus, our body's going to make that response and develop the antibodies so that we don't get the virus when we get a larger viral load from another human being. That's how this all works. You do a literature review, and then you develop hypotheses based on what you have learned from that literature review, based on the previous research. And then, once you develop these hypotheses, the hypotheses have to be testable. You have to phrase the hypothesis in the form of a question, just like in Jeopardy, that you can test. You can statistically test whether this is going to happen or this is going to happen. Is the result going to be greater or smaller? when you test a drug, is this drug going to have a greater effect or lesser of effect than this drug? Is this kind of training going to have a greater effect or lesser effect than this kind of training? You develop a hypothesis, and then you design an experiment that will allow you to statistically test your hypotheses. And then we either accept our hypothesis as being correct and true, or we reject our hypothesis based on the results of our experiment. We reject the hypothesis as being false. And so in your own life, use the scientific method to develop hypotheses, whether it's about your training or it's about something else in your life that you want to change. Develop hypotheses based on what happened before, and you can use your own life example based on the training that I've done before. If I make this kind of change to my training, what is the most likely thing that's going to happen? So you can use yourself as an experiment, and your history of training as your lit review. What has my history of training shown me? What do I believe to be true? What do I know to not be true? In what situations do I excel? In what situations do I fail? What kind of training has led me to those things? And then develop a hypothesis about how you can advance your training forward. And then go and test the hypothesis and try it. And then see what happens. And then decide, based on the results of that experiment, decide, is my hypothesis correct? Do I accept my hypothesis? Or do I reject my hypothesis? And that's the way you can use yourself as an experiment of one, and then you can change your training over time based on those trial and error, based on that experimentation. And so my thought for the day is to be your own scientist and hypothesize. Always hypothesize. It doesn't matter if your hypotheses turn out to be wrong. That's just as important as understanding the hypotheses that turn out to be right. It's just as important to understand things that are not right as it is that things are correct and that are right. And when you're trying to publish scientific research, it's always more helpful if you get statistically significant results. People want to see that, but it's just as helpful, it's just as valid to get results that are not statistically significant, because then you know that it was not true, that your hypothesis was not true, and then you've got to go in a different direction. It's just as valuable. And the same thing that, in our own lives, it's just as valuable to know the things that don't work as the things that do work. So that's my thought for the day. It's hypothesize with your own training, with your own life, and then come up with an experiment to test that hypothesis. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Run Talk from our beautiful studios in Southern California. This is Run Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. See you next week.